Good morning. I am Peggy Maniotis, the Executive Director of the USS Silverside Submarine Museum in Muskegon, Mission. Thank you for coming to our 34th annual Lost Boats ceremony. The ceremony is a little different this year because of the pandemic, and we are filming this virtually before the event. So thank you, and I hope you watch all the way through to the end. The ceremony contains a flyover, rifles being shot, the start of the engines of the USS Silversides. I mentioned those for those of you in attendance with young children and or animals. The noise generation could be disturbing to them. In just a moment, the Warbird Formation flight team will appear overhead, coming from the east and to your right. The T-34s were built in 50 trained Air Force Navy pilots. They are fully aerobatic and able to pull 6 Gs to -3 Gs. They cruise at 55 knots or close to 180 miles per hour. There were 348 Model A's built, along with 423 B models and 441 C models. A turbine variety was built and used for training Navy pilots until just recently at the Pensacola Naval Air Base. There are currently 270 of the 800 built flying today. All are painted in the schemes from their military training and division. 2 of the Hooligan planes are adorned with invasion stripes, black and white on the wing close to the fuselage. These stripes were painted on the aircraft participating in D-Day. Given the thousands of aircraft flying together that day, they used the stripes to differentiate the friendlies versus the enemies. They actually changed the pattern several times in case intelligence was gained and that the enemy was painting their aircraft in the same way. This group was formed in the late 1990s when Russ McDonald from Nepean, Indiana met John Workman at an air show, which happened to be their very first air show appearance in a T-34. Formation, flying, and friendship grew from that. Later, Tom Hipsink, Chuck Stauffer, and Rick Krepis from Battle Creek, Michigan joined the team along with Bill Kling from Grand Haven and Russ Bortzelman and Orland Wichman from Napoleon, Ohio. The team has been flying together for over 15 years. They appear in over 30 events annually, including up the NASCAR and the Indy races. In just a moment, a Warbird Formation will reappear overhead and perform the time-honored Missing Man Formation. Rooted in military history dating back to World War I, this ceremonial flyby honors those military personnel who have gone before us, many of them who gave their lives in the line of duty to protect our country and preserve the freedoms that we take for granted. Today, this ceremonial event is symbolic of the respect we offer all those who have served this great country in wartime and in peace. As the team approaches, you will note that the smoke trail of an aircraft shut down as the pilot gently pulls upward from the formation while turning west, signifying the reluctant departure from the earth of another brave warrior, the return of his soul to God's gift of eternal peace in heaven. Meanwhile, his Mingwen carry on without this brave warrior present. Let us have a moment of silence, remembering those who have gone before us as we await the arrival of the Missing Man Formation. Will everyone please rise as Post 9 prepares to post the colors and remain standing for the invocation, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner. Men not in uniform, please remove your hats. American Legion, Post 9, post the colors.
Face the color. Face the color. 3, 2, 1.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ready, 2. Assemble. Up.
Please bow your heads for the invocation. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, who art our refuge and strength at a very present time, help us, and at this time to put our trust in Thee, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to see us through. We thank Thee for the life and the love of all veterans. And we ask that their work they started on this earth be carried on in the hearts and the hands of their families and friends, because they leave behind more than just our memories.
Time. Time is one of our most precious commodities. The definition of time is the indefinite continued progress of existence and events in the past, present, and future, regarded as a whole. The value of time varies greatly depending on where we are in our lives and what we are doing. Is there enough time to get everything done? How long ago was that? Are we there yet? When will it finally be time for that special something to happen? I've got some time right now. What should I do? Lately, I have had time to go through old photo albums and loose pictures that should be in albums. It was fun to go through the memories, and a big part of that joy was in sharing it with others. Viewing the pictures together of what we did and where we went in the past is what photo albums are all about. Sadly, there seems to have come a time when I stopped printing pictures. Photography went digital. Pictures got stored in different methods and places, and there were no more physical pictures to hold, treasure, and share. And I wonder, without the physical reminders, will we lose future opportunities to walk down memory lane together? Recently, my daughter was cleaning out her room. she discovered a time envelope that she created about 15 years ago. The envelope stated it should not be opened until 2056. Why her younger self wanted it preserved for 61 years is a mystery to her current self. She could have chosen to leave it sealed for her future self in 2056, but curiosity as well as the desire to not have to keep track of it for decades got the best of her, and she opened it. And what did she find? The only thing in there was a list of all the people and the pets in her life at the time it was written. She laughed, shared it with me and her sister, and put it in a pile of things not to be saved. It may be something that will be remembered. Most likely, though, it will be forgotten. At that young age, it seems her idea of preserving time was completely tied to who shared time with her. Last year, the town where I live opened a time capsule that was buried 50 years earlier in 1969. In it, they found old photographs of local businesses and landmarks, commemorative coins, a pair of high-heeled shoes, a Playboy magazine, and a few packs of undoubtedly stale cigarettes. It was a town event which included some who had put the items in the box 50 years ago, and those who were just curious to see its contents. Together they shared the great reveal, and together they decided what items should be stored in this capsule to be buried for another 50 years and shared with the residents of the future. Time, it seems, is valued when preserved by objects and shared with others, family, friends, community. And there seems to be an immeasurable value to sharing time across time. As I stand here on the deck of this submarine, I can't help but feel that the USS Silverside Submarine Museum is in a way a time capsule, a glimpse into the history of our country. 75 years have passed since this submarine's last patrol. Who were we then? What were we doing? What were our values? And what would our past selves have wanted our present selves to learn from them? In 1945, many of us were not even born yet. Technology accidentally discovered food could be cooked with microwaves. About 5,000 homes had televisions. Bing Crosby and Betty Grable were big in the movies. Perry Como and Ella Fitzgerald entertained us on the radio. The Tigers beat the Cubs in the World Series. The Pistons, of Fort Wayne, were basketball champs. But perhaps some things never changed. The Lions did not make the playoffs that year. The average annual salary was $2,400, and a new house would set you back about $4,600. Information like this is fun to hear and compare to today. They are the kind of trivia tidbits we hear, smile about, forget, and move on to the necessities of our days. But the most important thing in 1945 is something that truly sets it apart from any other year in history. 75 years ago, in 1945, the United States of America declared victory in World War II in Europe and in Japan. That is not something that should just be smiled away as a whimsical little factoid. It should be remembered and honored forever. And that is why we are here. The USS Silverside Submarine Museum offers us a way to time travel, but unlike memories that lie untouched, unchanged, and buried in the ground for 50 years, or stored in a drawer until its author happens to stumble onto it while cleaning, this museum is a living, breathing time capsule that can and should be viewed often. Our military history is a collection of ordinary individuals who came together to accomplish something truly extraordinary, and we can learn from each and every one of them. Walk through the museum and be inspired by the determination of men who survived a sinking submarine in the middle of a war. Find out what brave young Americans will do to survive when faced with the horrors of a German prison camp. Go aboard a U.S. Coast Guard cutter and learn that in addition to the incredible challenges of search and rescue and enforcing prohibition, she and her crew answered the call to protect America in World War II from the Japanese coming to our country through the Alaskan Islands. Stories of our heroes are preserved in exhibits, shared in lectures on many topics throughout military history, and featured in special events. For this ceremony, though, we focus on the submarine. This is the 34th year we have gathered to mourn the loss of 52 American submarines and the more than 3,500 young men who were lost with them. The submarine force was crucial to the success of America in the war. Those who served aboard submarines had a much greater risk of not surviving the war than people in other branches of the military and on other types of vessels in the Navy. In our previous Lost Boat ceremonies, we have been graced with many wonderful speakers who have honored the service and sacrifice of the U.S. submarine force. Today we will continue with the tradition honoring each and every lost submarine and their crews later in this ceremony. But for a few minutes, we want to change the focus just a little bit. We want to take some time to share the memories of the sailors who did survive the war. Many of the staff members and volunteers of the museum have been honored to meet submarine veterans and family members from different eras, including World War II. Sometimes we are fortunate to meet family members of a Silversides veteran, and on very rare occasions, we meet a World War II veteran from the Silversides itself. The Silversides is an astonishing physical connection to the past. It was constructed with amazingly advanced technology for its time, and that we can explore, study, learn, and appreciate for its science alone. The submarine, though, is also the physical catalyst to remind us that it wasn't just an inanimate object fighting in the war. It was the people. It is the humanity of what was accomplished and endured, the feelings of pride, the fears, the goals, and the sacrifices of the young men aboard. It is a portal to a different time, place, and way of life that whispers to us across time. We treasure hearing these stories and sharing them with you because it is through the experiences of those who have lived to tell us what it was like then that we can more truly appreciate the sacrifices of those who gave their all and remain on eternal patrol today. It is through the survivors that we can know what the heroes of yesterday want those of us here today to remember and pass on to future generations. This is how we keep this time capsule timeless. For this year, honoring the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, we have chosen to share some of these stories with you today. It is our way of making sure this time capsule continues to be open to the past for all generations. Without keeping these stories alive, we fear that all World War II submarines will soon become lost boats. The USS Silverside Submarine Museum's mission is to do all we can to make sure that does not happen. So today, travel with us to the 1940s to meet true heroes. They gave years, and sadly too many gave a lifetime, to earn for us the freedoms all Americans enjoy. Today, let's spend a few minutes to listen, honor them, and thank them. And hopefully soon, you can come to the USS Silverside Submarine Museum and share our collective American history in this fantastic time capsule together with your family, friends, and us. We promise you, it will be well worth your time. It was just an ordinary day at work in mid-September and the phone rang. The voice on the other end asked if we could bend the rules of our tour just a little bit to allow him to go up in the conning tower. You see, I served on the Silversides during the war, and I was hoping to show my grandson where I worked. As I wrote down what he was saying, the excitement of what was about to happen began. I could hardly believe my ears and got a tingly feeling all over as he continued to give me his name and history on this submarine. A real Silversides veteran wants to come here to see his boat. Trying to remain calm on the phone, I offered him a deal. He could go in the conning tower if he agreed to share his stories with us. He laughed and said that would be fine. He would tell his stories if he could remember them. Over the next few weeks, I spoke with George Hawkins several times. He accepted the offer to have the engine started, and he wanted to know if he could come at 9, even though we do not open until 10. Every time we agreed, he thanked us profusely for being so accommodating and apologized for being such a bother. Really? Did he not know that this was more of a treat for us than for him, and there probably wasn't anything he would want that he could not get here? Really? Oh, the excitement here at the Silversides anticipating his visit was just like waiting for Santa. How many can meet him? Should we bring in the media? Should we just leave him alone with his family? Would he remember much? Would he really be able to get up into the conning tower? What would the day be like? We looked up his record in our Silversides book. He had served on patrols 6 through 14, earning his way up to first torpedoman. A plaque was made commemorating his service with a piece of the original teak deck attached to it. We invited the staff and volunteers to meet him, and we waited. Early in the morning before he arrived, I met his daughter in the parking lot. She worried that too many people might overwhelm him. I told her we would be respectful of the fact that this was a family visit, a special moment for a man and his grandson. And we waited. And then he arrived. A group of staff members and volunteers was gathered at the door to welcome him. I went to shake his hand, but we both knew it had to be a hug. The director tucked the plaque under my arm to present to him. I kind of knew what it said, but I had never really read it, and I had left my glasses upstairs in the office, so I couldn't read it then either. I told him what it was about, and then went with what I knew, the teak wood. I pointed that out to him. He asked if it was really from the original. I said, yes it is, and then pointed to a spot and said, I think I see your footprint right there. And that's all it took. Out came the first story. I remember falling through an open spot on the deck one time. The looks of admiration on the faces of everyone there was touching to see as he told his stories. But more than that, the twinkle in his eye was so moving as he soaked in the moment. He began to speak. Yes, they had a dog on board, but it was a mean dog. His children said he wasn't comfortable speaking to groups, but he kept speaking. His biggest fear was not hearing the dive alarms up on the lookout platform. They said he couldn't see well and his hearing aid batteries had gone out, but he answered every question that was asked. No, they were never allowed to just hang out on the deck. He said his memory was bad, but the stories and recollections kept coming. Jack Coy was the greatest skipper ever, cool at all times, under fire or not. They said offering him a chair and some water would be greatly appreciated, but this submariner had command of this museum crew, and the commander remained standing while the crew remained at full attention. Before we went to the submarine, he wanted to meet everyone in the group, shake their hands, and thank them for coming to see him, as if we were the ones who had done something special. We all went out to the Silversides, and the stories continued to flow. Mr. Hawkins bumped into a corner of the forward skid crossbeam and remembered he had done that years ago. Last time he hit it so hard it had left a scar in his side. He offered to lift his shirt and show us that scar, but his daughter assured him that was not necessary. Mr. Hawkins stayed for lunch and continued to share his memories. He stayed until the museum closed. He told his stories, walked through the sub, took his grandson into the conning tower, and showed him the lookout spot he had manned years ago. We all learned so much from him, and a tour at the Silversides will never be the same again. Perhaps the next day, he and all of us enjoyed a nice quiet day to recover and absorb from everything the day before. But on Tuesday, September 30th, Disney World had serious competition for being the happiest place on Earth. One of the things I learned during the visit was that George lived only about an hour away from my parents in Florida. When he left, he told me I could call any time, and if I ever wanted to visit him, that would be wonderful. I said that would be great, but I wondered, was it one of those polite conversations you have, but nothing ever comes of it? As it turns out, no. On my next visit to see my parents, he did welcome me into his home. He had many more stories to tell and photographs from his time on the Silversides, and this was just the beginning. Over the next several years, we visited, emailed, and talked on the phone. He answered my questions about the Silversides and submarines in general. He showed me more photos and memorabilia, and added to his pictures on the walls of his home were prints of the photos taken during his visit here, the young warrior and the returning hero. It was awesome. He got so excited when I called on business. We needed to talk torpedoes, so much more exciting than talking about how everyone is feeling, according to him. Apparently, torpedo stuff is like riding a bike. You never forget. When I sent him a winter picture of the sub freezing her torpedoes off, he said he was glad he was not here. Then he connected me to Silversides veteran Joe Allison, who recalled being on lookout near Honshu where it was so cold that his hands got so stiff and he needed help unbuttoning his coat when he came back in. I shared a picture of me, the sissy afraid of heights, when I finally made it up there. He applauded my bravery, said I was a much truer submariner now. I told him how long it took me to get up and back down, and he told me I would have had footprints on my head. He described how they did it. We laughed and agreed it was clearly a system designed for young men and not older women. George was always thrilled when we connected him to a family member of a crewmate. He told them what their dad was like then and learned what the crewmate had done after the war. They had all promised to keep in touch, but over the years sometimes lost contact. Many times I asked if we could record his stories, but he always declined, saying he was just not much of a public speaker. On October 16, 2019, though, on his 94th birthday, George realized what treasures he held in his mind. He had his daughters transcribe his memories and send them to us. He wrote how he enlisted when he was in the 10th grade. He attended sub-school in New London, Connecticut, then took a train to San Francisco, where he boarded a converted luxury liner to Brisbane, Australia. He worked as part of the relief crew, but when asked if he wanted to go to sea, he said yes. He was assigned to the USS Silversides under Commander Coy and stayed on this sub through the end of the war. They usually spent 2 months on patrol and 1 on rest and refit. They spent a lot of time in Saipan, Tinian, the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, Guam, Brisbane, Sydney, and Pearl Harbor. They often refueled and stayed overnight at Midway. He said a lot of boats got stuck on the rocks there, but Silversides never did. Once, while in Guam, the boys took a bus to a banana plantation and decided to borrow some of the bananas until the rightful owners chased them off with machetes. He shared that they often went out in packs of 3 or 4 subs. His group was called Corey's Raiders. On one patrol with the pack, the USS Flounder had her afterhatch blown off, and they could no longer submerge. The Silversides was ordered to stay above water the whole time while they escorted the Flounder back to Guam. He also recalled the time a torpedo got stuck in the tube. After 7 hours of working on a plan, Lieutenant Commander Nichols ordered all back full. This allowed them to refire the torpedo. In his calm way of explaining these scary stories, he said, "It was a tense time, but everyone acted professionally and got the job done." He shared the memory of a crewmate who got electrocuted in the maneuvering room. Chief Lloyd, the only man to serve all 14 patrols, brought the man into the aft torpedo room, performed CPR, and brought him back to life. He recalled the time they were pinned down by the Japanese for 24 hours. Being down this long is so dangerous as the hydrogen gas builds up and can become very explosive. They were finally able to get away long enough to surface and recharge a bit, but 6 hours later, the Japanese were back. This time, the Silversides was able to alternate surfacing, charging full speed ahead, charging the batteries, and then diving again. This process continued for a long time, but it finally worked. One of their last jobs was rescuing 2 downed escort pilots off of Nagasaki. He said what made this really dangerous was that the water where they did this was not deep enough to submerge. Imagine, not enough water to dive, and the enemy is everywhere. By the end of the war, Mr. Hawkins worked his way up to torpedoman first class in charge of the aft torpedo room. At the time, he saw nothing wrong with a teenager being in charge of that. Later in life, he sometimes wondered, what was everyone thinking? Of course, they were probably thinking, they're all kids, but they are who we have here. After the war, the Silversides was decommissioned. She went through the Panama Canal. She needed to submerge near Florida to avoid a hurricane. They stopped along the Hudson River on the way to allow people to see her. The sub was decommissioned on April 17, 1946, and she went out with a bang. The bow went over the top of the pier and hit a truck. I'm sure there must be a box somewhere to check on an insurance claim that states your truck was damaged in a collision with a submarine. George wondered if the dent is still there. On December 3, 2019, his daughter gave me the news I knew was coming but didn't want to hear. The USS Silverside Submarine Museum had lost a true treasure and a true American hero. USS Silverside submarine World War II veteran George Hawkins passed away at the age of 94. George came to visit with his family in 2014. Since then, he has shared with us so many memories. From the 16-year-old kid ready to take on the world, to the 17-year-old boy who joined his crewmates in different pranks, to the 18-year-old young adult who survived a barrage of 78 depth charges, to the 19-year-old man in charge of torpedoes on a submarine in the middle of the ocean in the middle of a war. He ended these memories by stating for those who were not there that this war and all wars, no matter how they are glorified, are really bad. As his health was failing and he knew there wasn't much time left to share, he closed with these words: "It's important to me that everyone knows that I did the best I could." Your best, George, was a gift to America and a gift to this museum, and no words can ever thank you enough for all you did. I don't know if it's okay for a civilian to wish you fair winds and following seas. So I will close with saying, I will miss you deeply, George Hawkins, but I know you will always be here with me and with us in your beloved USS Silverside submarine. Thank you, George.
Thanks, Teresa. My name is Gary McKean. I'm a volunteer here at the USS Silverside submarine, and for the last 8 summers I've had the honor and privilege to tell the story of the men who served on the USS Silversides during World War II. One of the first things that we talk about on a tour are the facts of the Silverside. Some of the facts are pretty simple. The boat's 312 feet in length. It's 27 feet in the beam, or 27 feet wide. She has a draft of 13 feet. She carried a crew of 8 officers and 65 enlisted men. And during that time of World War II, they were on 14 war patrols. Additionally, she was brought into the Navy 8 days after Pearl Harbor was bombed. That's when she was commissioned fully. Her keel was laid at the Mare Island facility in November of 1940, and she was decommissioned in 1947 at New London, Connecticut. During that time, she sunk 30 Japanese ships. She heavily damaged 14 others. And she picked up 2 American airmen toward the end of the war on one of her last cruises. Some of the remarkable men that served on the USS Silversides were her skippers. Lieutenant Commander Creed Burlingame was the first skipper. He was on for 5 war patrols. Creed Burlingame was a U.S. Naval Academy graduate in 1927. And he served from December 1941 till July of 43, earning 2 Silver Stars and 3 Navy Crosses. He retired as a Rear Admiral. The second in command at that time was Lieutenant Commander John Jack Coy, U.S. Navy Academy, graduated in 1933. He was on patrols 6 through 11, July of 1943 to November of 1944. He was awarded 3 Navy Crosses, and he also retired as a retired admiral, a Rear Admiral. Commander John Nichols, he was the captain the last 3 war patrols. He was a survivor of the Squalus. The Squalus was a submarine that went down in May of 1939 on the Atlantic coast, and of many of the men, they were stuck down in the hull of the boat. John was one of the 33 that survived this terrible atrocity. On the 4th War Patrol, the boat was commanded by Creed Burlingame. His XO was a fellow who was a lieutenant commander at the time as well, and his name was Roy Davenport. Roy Davenport was quite an interesting fellow, to say the least. Later in life, he retired as a Rear Admiral as well, after in command of the USS Haddock. On the 4th War Patrol, however, it was particularly problematic during the time of the Silversides. George Plattner was a gentleman who was a fireman on board, and he suffered an acute appendicitis attack. Fortunately, Thomas Moore, who was a pharmacist mate, had a long history of observing surgeries as a surgical nurse. Through operation that was performed on the wardroom table, they were able to relieve George of his appendix. And during that time, he recuperated and survived the war as a good Navy man. 2 days after the appendicitis attack, the boat was off the coast of Japan, and at that time, the boat encountered a Japanese fishing vessel. And as the boat went to attack, they found that what they thought was a fishing vessel was in fact a 2-stack enemy destroyer. In order to get away from the destroyer, they dove the boat in an emergency dive. They then evaded the enemy doing that maneuver. As they went back up to the surface, they were then surprise attacked by a Japanese bomber who dropped 3 bombs on the boat. One of the bombs severely damaged the bow diving planes. As the boat was continuing to dive, they realized that the boat could not get to neutral buoyancy. So again, Roy Davenport, the executive officer, came down to the forward torpedo room, and he very quickly found the overriding clutch. He pulled a cotter pin out of the overriding clutch, and they were able to neutralize the diving planes and eventually bring the boat back up to the surface where repairs could be made. Additionally, on the 4th War Patrol, they had encountered a small convoy of 3 Japanese cargo ships. All 3 cargo ships were successfully sunk by the Silversides using 6 torpedoes. The problem was that the 6th torpedo, they weren't sure that it cleared the boat. They called it the dangling torpedo. Eventually, they brought the boat to a point where one of the crewmen went over the side, and he in fact investigated and found that the torpedo had been fired correctly. All that was hanging up was in fact the outer door. During also the 4th Patrol, they encountered a severe amount of depth charging, and they developed a fuel leak in the number 5 ballast tank. Fuel was removed and pumped into number 3, and as they got back closer to Pearl Harbor, their port at that point, they were encountering the fact that they were running low on fuel. And when they got back to port, eventually they found that they had 5 hours left of fuel, so they cut it pretty close. Did not want to run out of fuel in the Pacific. Additionally, on the 1st War Patrol of the USS Silversides, we lost one of our crewmen, Mike Harbin. Mike was 18 years old, and he was a torpedoman 3rd class. He was working on a gun on deck. The boat encountered a small Japanese trawler. The trawler opened fire. The Silversides returned fire. Unfortunately, one of those shells or one of those bullets hit Mike and killed him instantly, and he was buried at sea off the coast of Japan. If you consider that this submarine was on 14 war patrols traveling on average between 10 and 11,000 miles at a time, and they sunk 30 Japanese ships, and they heavily damaged 14 others, Mike was in fact the only man who has lost his soul, his life, on this boat during World War II. The U.S. Navy always thought this boat to be the luckiest submarine of the fleet, but it certainly had to do with the crew, the wonderful crew they had, as well as the captain and all of the men that survived the war and made it what it was, the success that it was. One of the men that served on the boat for 9 war patrols was a fellow that Teresa's talked about. His name is George Hawkins, and George came and visited our boat in 2015, I believe, and I got to meet George and talk with him and spent a number of hours with him. I also had the opportunity to talk with him on the phone several times and also corresponded with letters and emails. George wrote me a lengthy letter that were many of his stories. And one of his stories is one of my favorites. I was sitting on my bunk in the aft torpedo room when a commotion startled me in the hall. Clarence Little Kelly dragged a crewmate, Marion Red Borowski, into the room and laid him on the floor. Borowski had been in the maneuvering room, which is a very small room full of wires and electrical controls, and he got entangled in those wires and was electrocuted. Kelly freed him up and yelled for help. Chief Calvin Lloyd performed CPR on him and brought him back to life. Electrical burns are very bad and burn like this for quite a while. They applied salve to put the fire out on his body, and he was able to return to work shortly. Chief Lloyd was the only crew member to serve on all 14 patrols of the Silversides. This last summer, I had the honor to walk through the boat on a tour with Red Borowski's family, and we were presented actually with the incident report of that. And I'll just read briefly that. This is on October 3rd, 1944 at about 1700 hours. Marion T. Borowski, electrician, 2nd class, U.S. Naval Reserve, was working on the control cubicle in the USS Silversides, and he accidentally leaned back against the 2 main rotor rheostats that were energized. The heavy current immediately rendered him unconscious and held him rigidly on the rheostat. As we go through this, we see that the Clarence D. Kelly was named as the person who saved his life, and with severe burns, he was moved to the Navy hospital at Pearl Harbor. What we don't know by reading these two accounts is what his family filled us in on. And the fact was that Dad, as they called him, Marion Red Borowski, he was in the Navy hospital for 2 weeks. And he found out that the Silversides was going back out on service and duty, and that he wanted to be on that boat because he knew that Jack Coy, the commander, and the crew were the best crew in the Navy, and he didn't want to go on any other submarine. So he checked himself out of the hospital and he hightailed it back to the sub, and on it he got, and off they went to war for another tour. Additionally, about 6 years ago, when I was doing a tour, I came to the museum at a very early time. It was about 9 o'clock before the museum door opened. And there was a gentleman standing at the front door with a friend of his. And he turned out to be a cook on the Harder, the USS Harder, which was one of the 52 submarines that were lost during the war. This gentleman basically said that he wondered if we had any memorabilia of the Harder. And I didn't know if we did, but we did search the museum and found that we did not. But we do have the Harder's name on the front door area, along with the 52 submarines. But during that time, this gentleman told us the story that he was a cook on the Harder, and he was on for 5 war patrols. And at the time, he got dung day fever, which is a mosquito-borne illness. And he was taken off the boat at Pearl Harbor and put in the hospital. The Harder went out on the next patrol, the 6th patrol, and unfortunately the Harder was lost. This gentleman said he never was able to reconcile the loss of his crew on that boat, and he went through the rest of his life with this, wearing this on his shoulder as certainly something that he harbored against for a long time. That day we walked on the Silversides, and we walked through the boat with this gentleman and his friend and relived some of his experiences. It was quite a touching time, to say the least. And I have to say there were very few dry eyes as we walked through the boat, and he remembered the story of the Harder. George also liked to tell stories when he was here. And one of the stories that he wrote to me, he told us the story the day he was here, but he also wrote me a lengthy letter in his own words. And I'd like to read George's own words of this story, because I can't really paraphrase it as well as George says it. I'm not certain if the incident I'm about to tell you about is our 9th or 10th war patrol, but it certainly has stuck in my mind all these years. We were patrolling as normal when Commander Coy spotted a small convoy. We proceeded into position of our attack and sunk 3 vessels in the encounter. Our problem was getting away from the enemy. There were many destroyers and destroyer escorts zigzagging back and forth, trying to attack us and sink us. Commander Coy was trying every maneuver in the submarine manual to get away. In the end, all Commander Coy could do was to go into silent running and try to evade the enemy as best we could. All motors and equipment were turned off, with only the propellers and very slow cavitation to maintain buoyancy. No coughs, sneezes, or even burping were allowed, as even one of these sounds might give way to our position. The destroyers and destroyer escorts continued to pass over us, dropping depth charges. The attacks seemed as though they would last forever, but it was really hours, about 8 hours. One of the enemy vessels actually passed directly over the sub, and we could hear the propellers with the familiar swish, swish, swish of the blades hitting the water. It was a very scary time, to say the least, and everyone was wondering if our luck was about to run out and the depth charge from that ship could very well sink us. When all the attacks were over, the count was 73 depth charges were dropped on the boat, trying to sink us and bring us up to the surface. To anyone who's ever been on a submarine during a depth charge attack, it's hard to imagine the force of a barrel of TNT going off and sinking and shaking a ship that's 300 feet below the surface. Our sub was nothing but a steel vessel with no shock or sound absorption material on the boat to lessen the effects of one of these devices. You can't brace your body as you normally would to break, or it would break your spine. All you could do is hold on to something and be in your bunk, either lying down or sitting. And believe me when I tell you that no one could even imagine the size of that attack. All you could hear was click, click before the device went off, and you could only try to think pleasant things and not the situation to keep you from losing your mental control. For me, my salvation in this attack came in two ways. The first was Commander Coy. His cool demeanor was calming, a calming ingredient in a very stressful situation. This was not true not only this day, but all the days he was in command of the USS Silversides. He was a true leader in every sense of the word. I never saw him lose his calm and reassuring way, no matter what the situation. He got us through this attack and many others, which left our crew saying that we had the very best skipper in the entire sub-fleet. The other thing that helped me was the fact that he knew that our boat was so well built. Our boat performed well and aided Commander Coy in performing to the best of his ability. So this is George's remembrance of a commander that he had a lot of faith in, and also the fact that Red Borowski wanted to get back to this boat to sail with Commander Coy. In 1976, one of the clippings I was able to find was the Chicago Sun-Times on March 14th of 1976. And it was a reunion of the USS Silverside's crew, actually two ex-sub skippers. One, Mr. Rear Admiral Jack Coy, retired, and Captain John Nichols. And they're shown in the forward torpedo room. During the interview, Commander Coy basically chimed in, it said, with a memory of a nightmarish 5-hour depth charge attack by Japanese ships with about 70 counted near misses. So this obviously was something that stuck in all the crew's mind, Commander Coy included. Of course, George, he certainly remembered that fact very well. The boat was awarded 12 battle stars during the course of their 14 war patrols. They also were awarded a Presidential Unit Citation. This last summer, Red Borowski's family, Marion Borowski's family, gave us the original copy of Mr. Borowski's award from the President of the United States. And I think it's very telling to talk very shortly about this. The President of the United States takes the pleasure in presenting the Presidential Unit Citation to the United States ship USS Silversides for the service as set forth the following. Citation: for outstanding performance in combat during her 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th war patrols in enemy Japanese-controlled waters. Daring tactics and tenacious in the face of particularly hazardous conditions, the USS Silversides tracked her targets with relentless aggression. In audacious and defiance of heavy enemy escorts and air opposition, she boldly penetrated hostile screens to launch her torpedoes, striking repeatedly at every quarter with devastating results to the Japanese in the destruction of 24 ships and extensive damage to 12 additional vessels. Her exceptional skill in evading severe depth charge attacks and her intrepid fulfillment in perilous missions necessary to defeat fiercely determined foe against the superb combat readiness of her gallant officers and men. For the President, signed by James Forrestal, Secretary of the Navy. That was on April 11th, 1947. During my time as a tour guide, I've had some very interesting visitors that have come to us, everything from the governor of Michigan a couple of years ago and his family. But one thing that ran really well with me was a woman and her husband that came from London, England. They had flown into Detroit, and they were traveling to Chicago, and they wanted to come to see our Silverside Museum. And the lady was on our tour, and we last typically about an hour and a half or so. And I happened that day to tell the story of my father, who was actually a POW in World War II, and how he was captured by the Germans and held in Fallingvostel in Germany when he was a young man. But during the course of our walk through the boat, our tour, the lady paid particularly attention to the facts of the boat and the crew and many of the things I've just said. We got up on deck, and she was probably a lady in her late 70s, I would imagine, and she asked if she could give me a hug. Well, I don't get many hugs on tours, but she gave me a big hug, and she said, "I want to thank you on behalf of all the people of England for saving England during World War II." And I explained to her, "Ma'am, I was not born until after the war." She said, "Well, your father was certainly one of those men." She said, "The United States never gets enough credit for saving England because things would be much different today in Europe had the Americans not stepped in and taken charge." I want to close with a very short piece that George gave me. And it's basically words that George wanted us to live by. And George said to me one day, "It's important to me that everyone knows that I did the very best I could." And he went on to explain that my purpose in writing my memories is to remind the tour guides and the people that visit our boat as we walk through the submarine in Muskegon, Michigan, that war and all wars, no matter how glorified, are really bad. George was a dear friend. We all miss George and his stories and his memories, but they'll live on, and I'll be happy to tell that story as time goes on. I also want to say thank you to the staff of the USS Silverside Museum. They do a wonderful job day in and day out, and also the board of directors, and certainly to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Frank Marzak. Frank kind of took me under his arm 8 years ago when I started volunteering here, and he's become a dear friend of mine for a long time. He was our executive director for a period of time and also chairman of our board that I serve on today. So thank you, Frank, and all of our folks that make everything possible at the museum.
Today, Gary and Teresa honored a man who had served on the Silversides during World War II. I would like to take this moment to honor a person who made that possible, Dean Recknagel. Dean, a lifelong Muskegon resident, grew up during World War II and recognized the sacrifices of so many in our community to make the world safe. In addition to being a loving father and husband, he was a local pharmacist and businessman. Dean was part of a group of gentlemen who in the 1980s wished to honor Muskegon's graced past as an arsenal of democracy and the men and women of our country who fought to make our freedoms free and save democracy. Dean was present for the negotiations to bring the Silversides to Muskegon, as well as part of the crew who brought her to Muskegon. He remained an active board member, continuing to share his gifts and wisdom until the day he died, January 7th, 2007. I applaud Dean for his selfless efforts to honor all past, present, and future veterans. He could never have imagined the wonderful legacy he has given to our community and the world. May his memory be eternal.
Greetings from Kings Bay, Georgia. I am Mike Bernacchi, the Admiral in charge of Submarine Group 10, the group in charge of all the ballistic missile and cruise missile submarines on the East Coast. I'm also a fellow Michigander. I grew up in Pleasant Ridge, Michigan, went to Royal Oak Shrine, graduated from the University of Detroit and the University of Michigan, where I hold graduate degrees in nuclear and industrial engineering. But most importantly, I met my wife of 32 years, who's also a Michigander, who was from Sterling Heights. It's an honor to be with you for the traditional tolling of the bell ceremony. The tolling of the bell ceremony is something that us submariners stop, listen every year. It is a sacred ceremony, for it is when we remember those who are on eternal patrol. It is also a time we stop and remember our heritage. Our heritage, which reminds us who we really are. Marcus Garvey once wrote, "A people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." The submarine force was born in World War II. Men like Fluckey, O'Kane, Mush Morton. Ships like the Barb and the Silverside, who did 14 war patrols, 12 battle stars, and sunk 23 ships. When you look at all of that, you look at what those men did, the highest casualty rate of World War II. Every time a submariner gets their dolphins, we stop and we remember those who are the heritage of who we are. It is appropriate that during the tolling of the bell, we stop and we remember. The submarine force today may not look much like the submarine force of yesteryear. When you think of the Gato class, then you think of today's Virginia, Ohio, Los Angeles, Seawolf. They don't look anything alike. The submarines of today look more like spaceships. The one thing that remains constant is the crews that man her. The men and women of today, they have the same toughness, tenacity, resiliency, and dedication as the crews of old. Matter of fact, that is where we got it. The endurance of today's ships is great. But this generation, like the generations before, loves and serves with honor. I would like to thank the veterans who have led the way, who have shown what it is to serve. I would also like to take a minute to thank the unsung heroes, the families. The families never take an oath, but they serve and wear the cloth of the nation. I have to go no further than my own wife. She did not know that her husband would spend about 8 years under the water and be a single parent. And then our youngest is about to enter his 3rd year at the Naval Academy, who's also a football player. So she's a Navy mom and a Navy wife. She serves all the time. She and the thousands and thousands of family members throughout the world who support their military member, they serve each and every day. Without them, our military could not function. For those family members and loved ones, I give a special thanks for everything that you do. Sometimes people get Memorial Day, Veterans Day confused. It is important to remember that on Memorial Day, that is a day that we honor our dead. Memorial Day, the day that you have chosen to do the tolling of the bell ceremony, to honor those on eternal patrol. It is said that a person dies twice. One when the breath leaves their body, and the next when they are no longer ever remembered. So it is important for us as submariners that we always do the tolling of the bells. That way those who are on eternal patrol are never forgotten and hence immortal. So I salute you for what you are about to do, and thank you for giving tribute to those who had served and given the ultimate sacrifice. God bless our country. God bless the veterans in the audience and all of those who have served. And as always, go blue.
Dive, dive. For the enlightenment of our guests who may not understand the significance of the ceremony tolling of the boats, I shall give you a brief explanation of this solemn remembrance of our shipmates, the officers and enlisted men who sacrificed the lives aboard submarines in the service of our country. John F. Kennedy once said, "A nation reveals itself not only by the men it produces, but by the men it honors and it remembers." It is true that the sea has always taken its toll of seamen. This is especially true for the submariner. Over the years, some 4,000 young men have lost their lives in circumstances serving our country in the U.S. submarine force. In all, a total of 72 submarines have been lost in war and peace. It is also true that no maritime power has ever survived unless its men have been willing to fight back with successfully better ships manned by professional seamen who have profited by the lessons learned from the past. Those of us who go to sea in today's submarines and those who will do so in the future are forever indebted to those submarine sailors who gave their lives testing different innovations in submarine warfare during times of peace. The losses, while tragic, have served to provide us with invaluable knowledge to enable us to improve succeeding classes of submarines and our gallant extensions of the traditions of duty, professional competence, and self-sacrifice, which have always been the hallmark of the U.S. submarine force. The U.S. submarine force came into existence on October 12, 1900, with the commissioning of the USS Holland, SS-1. The early 1900s were a period of intense development, resulting in the adoption of gasoline engines for surface propulsion, the periscope, and improvements in double hull design. In 1906, with most of the fleet in the Atlantic, the Secretary of the Navy approved submarines as the only way to defend the west coast of the United States if attacked. Yet on the eve of World War I, 1914, the U.S. submarine force only numbered 34 submarines. During World War I, the Secretary of the Navy adopted the position that submarines would defend the vital fleet port at Subic Bay, Philippines, and position boats there. Between 1914 and 1940, the U.S. submarine force would suffer the loss of 11 submarines, 150 submariners, and in testing new designs. Despite these setbacks, the U.S. submarine force continued to grow. One submariner, Torpedoes Man Second Class Henry Bernot, received the Medal of Honor for his selfless courage. The years of 1941 through 1945 were years of monumental struggle and sacrifice for all Americans. The objectives were to protect and preserve the freedoms of the United States of America, as well as those of our friends and allies. To this end, our entire nation, both civilian and military, were rendered to the full measure of that devotion. Immediately following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 7, 1941, with the Pacific Fleet in ruins, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, a submariner himself, upon taking command as Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, recognized the true military value of the submarine. In January 1942, he raised his official flag on board submarine Grayling, and upon relinquishing command, took down his flag aboard the submarine Menhendon. It was the submarine force, stated Nimitz, that I looked to carry the load until our great industrial activity could produce the weapons we so sorely needed to carry the war to the enemy. It is to the everlasting honor and glory of our submarine personnel that they never failed us in our days of great peril, and that they did. This small force, composed of about 50,000 men, including staff and backup personnel, less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel, and by war's end consisting of 288 submarines, inflicted a staggering 55% of Japanese maritime losses. Of approximately 6 million tons comprising the entire Japanese merchant fleet from 1941 through 1945, U.S. submarines sank 1,113 Japanese merchant marine vessels for a total of 4,859,643 tons. During that same period, U.S. submarines sunk 214 naval warships for an additional 577,626 tons, about a third of all Japanese warships destroyed. Seldom, if ever in history, has so small a naval force accomplished so much. Japan's war effort depending on shipping, it was sunk in the main by the U.S. submarines. However, these successes did not come without a price. 52 American submarines were lost during World War II. Many of our numbers were lost in the performance of those duties. Some men lost their lives individually, but by far the greater number died as boats failed to return from patrol. In some instances, the cause of the submarine's loss was known, but in most cases the report, "submarine overdue, presumed loss," was the epitaph for both submarine and men. A few rescued by the Japanese, imprisoned until the war's end, and from those we learn of the fate of the ship and the crew. The price overall was that the U.S. submarine force suffered the highest percentage of losses of any branch of the armed services. 3,500 submariners quietly paid the ultimate price in the defense of their country, which quickly earned the U.S. submarine force the nickname the Silent Service. 7 submariners were awarded the Medal of Honor during World War II, 2 posthumously. More than 50 years have passed since the lost men of World War II departed on their eternal patrol. We submarine veterans endeavor to keep alive the memory of our departed shipmates at every gathering of our organizations. We do this by honoring their memory in the prayer Tolling of the Boats, calling the roll of those submarines lost since U.S. submarine force was established in 1900. Still, no one close to the submarine service can reflect on those tragic times without experiencing the shock and sadness felt upon hearing of the loss of the USS Thresher and USS Scorpion. And yet those losses added an awareness to the initial emotions the submariners and those persons closely associated with this branch of the service today know the feelings of kinship, of pride, of gratitude, and a profound respect for the gallant men lost on those submarines. They are remembered not as men who were, but as men who are. Men who, because of their dedication to their profession of the undersea, have given us greater knowledge of its mysteries and opened broader paths for its exploration and use. For many of us, they live on as specific individuals, each contributing his special skills to the ever-broadening knowledge. To us, they will be more vivid in memory for much longer than those of us who in physical sense are nearby. They, all of them, have served you and this great land of ours in a way far beyond contributions of most of us. Their contributions continue by providing others close to the Undersea Navy inspiration, new challenges, new ideas, and new operational methods. No, they are not nearby in flesh, but for those of us who know them, they are very real in contribution, in memory, and in spirit. We shall not forget them. We shall now proceed with the ceremony.
Sea Lion. Sunk by aerial bomb, December 25th, 1941. 4 men lost, 1 died as POW. S-36. Ran aground, January 21st, 1942. No loss of life. S-26. Rammed by escort, January 24th, 1942. 46 men lost, 3 survivors. Shark. Sunk by surface craft, February 11th, 1942. 59 killed, all hands lost. Perch. Sunk by surface craft, March 3rd, 1942. All 59 taken prisoner, 6 died as POWs. S-27. Ran aground, June 19th, 1942. No loss of life. Grunion. Sunk by surface craft, July 31st, 1942. 70 men lost. S-39. Ran aground, August 13, 1942. No loss of life. Argonaut. Sunk by surface craft, January 10th, 1943. 102 men lost. Amberjack. Sunk by surface craft, February 14th, 1943. 74 men lost. Grampus. Sunk by surface craft, between February and March 1943. 71 men lost. Triton. Sunk by surface craft, March 15th, 1943. 74 men lost. Pickerel. Sunk by surface craft, April 3rd, 1943. 74 men lost. Grenadier. Sunk by aerial bombs, April 22nd, 1943. All 76 crew taken prisoner, 4 died as POWs. Runner. Sunk by enemy mines between May and July of 1943. 78 men lost. R-12. Sank, cause unknown. June 12, 1943. 42 men lost, 33 survivors. Pompano. Sunk by enemy mines between August and September 1943, 77 men lost. Grayling. Sank, cause unknown, September 9, 1943, 76 men lost. Cisco. Sunk by surface craft, September 28, 1943, 76 men lost. S-44. Sunk by surface craft, October 7, 1943, 56 men lost, 2 survivors taken prisoner. Wahoo. Sunk by aerial bombs, October 11, 1943, 80 men lost. Dorado. Sunk by friendly aircraft, October 12, 1943, 77 men lost. Corvina. Sunk by enemy submarine, November 16, 1943, 82 men lost. Sculpin. Sunk by surface craft, November 19, 1943, 63 men lost, 21 taken prisoner. Capeland. Sunk by surface craft, November of 1943, 76 men lost. Scorpion. Sunk by enemy mines, January 1944, 77 men lost. Grayback. Sunk by surface craft, February 27, 1944, 80 men lost. Trout. Sunk by enemy mines, February 29, 1944, 81 men lost. Tullabee. Sunk by own torpedo, March 26, 1944, 79 men killed, 1 survived as POW. Gudgeon. Sunk by surface craft, April 18, 1944, 79 men lost. Herring. Sunk by surface craft, June 1st, 1944, 83 men lost. Galette. Sunk by surface craft, June 14th, 1944, 82 men lost. S-28. Sank, cause unknown, July 4, 1945, 49 men lost. Robalo. Sunk by enemy mines, July 26, 1944. 77 men lost, 4 taken prisoner, none survived as POWs. Flyer. Sunk by enemy mines, August 13, 1944. 78 men lost, 8 survivors. Harder. Sunk by surface craft, August 24, 1944. 79 men lost. Seawolf. Sunk by friendly fire, October 3rd, 1944, 83 men lost, plus 17 Army personnel. Escalar. Sunk by enemy mines, October 17th, 1944, 82 men lost. Darter. Ran aground, October 24th, 1944, no loss of life. Shark 2. Sunk by surface craft, October 24, 1944, 87 men lost. Tang. Sunk by its own torpedo, October 24, 1944, 78 men lost, 9 survived as POWs. Albacore. Sunk by enemy mines, November 7th, 1944, 85 men lost. Growler. Sank, cause unknown, November 8th, 1944, 86 men lost. Scamp. Sunk by surface craft, November 11th, 1944, 83 men lost. Swordfish. Sank, cause unknown, January 1945, 89 men lost. Barbell, sunk by aerial bombs. February 4th, 1945, 81 men lost. Keat, sank, cause unknown, March 20, 1945, 87 men lost. Trigger, sunk by surface craft, March 28, 1945, 89 men lost. Snook, sank, cause unknown, April 9th, 1945, 84 men lost. Lagarto, sunk by surface craft, May 3rd, 1945, 86 men lost. Bonefish, sunk by surface craft, June 18th, 1945, 85 men lost. Bullhead, sunk by aerial bombs, August 6th, 1945, 84 men lost.
Surface, surface.
Surface, surface. American Legion, Post 9, retire the colors.
Oh God. Forward, up. Detail off. Colors, hold. Retire the colors. Breathe it up. Ready? 2. Assemble. Go.
Prepare to get underway. Station the maneuvering watch. Single up the lines. Light off number 3. Light off. Number 4, main engine. As we conclude the 34th annual Lost Boats ceremony, I would like to thank all the men and the women of the United States military that to continue to serve our country in times of great peril. They continue to answer whatever call is placed in front of them by our government, and this year has been no different than others. Thank you to the future heroes of the United States of America. I would also like to thank all of the people that have made this possible and ask for the continued support of our institution. Our board of directors had the foresight over 35 years ago to found this organization to honor the men and women of the United States military, and we do that each and every day through education and preservation. Without our board's support, none of this would be possible. So I'd like everyone to thank our board, please, for that, as well as our many sponsors. This year is a little different, but we still have so many sponsors out there. Flowers by Ray and Sharon, Gordon Food Service, Myers, Nichols Paper and Supplies, 2 West Greenhouse, Bigby Coffee, the City of Muskegon, G&L Chili Dogs, Lee's Famous Recipe Chicken, and the West Michigan New Horizons Band Ensemble that, if it was possible, would have been here today playing with us. And we appreciate everyone who is here watching this. As you're watching this at home, and everyone is doing their part to make our country well again, please consider making a donation, USS Silverside Submarine Museum, on our website, so that we may continue our mission of honoring the men and the women of the United States military each and every day.